Welcome everyone to another edition of Play It Through, and on this edition it's Decap Attack, brought to us by Vic Tokai. Decap Attack is an action platformer that was changed up greatly from its Japanese version, which was actually a game based on the anime known as Magical Hat. Both games, though, as far as gameplay is concerned, is actually based on two earlier Vic Tokai games, Psycho Fox on the Sega Master System, and before that, Kid Cool on the NES. So here we go with Decap Attack for the Sega Genesis. After the opening cutscene, you can then get to the start menu where you can change up the options, including your health, where you're able to make it either easier or harder by having less or more. The default though is 2, which is what we're going to be playing on. Throughout the levels, you can actually find a couple of bonus hearts, so in total you could actually have up to 5 hearts of health at one time. In Decap Attack, you're playing as Chuck, and your goal is to travel through the different islands of this weird skeleton-shaped world and piece together all the islands back to one spot. The levels are broken up into 3 segments each, with a boss being at the end. During the third part of a particular world, you have to find a hidden item located in one of the breakable objects. These objects are scattered throughout each level and contain a variety of items, but in that third part of the world, there's one key item that you have to have or you won't be able to beat the boss and then go on and get to the exit. Your offense in the game is your ability to send out your eyeballs, basically, in order to attack enemies. You can also find this skull that every time you attack, you're able to throw it off your head in order to take out enemies. You can also throw it on the ground during boss encounters to hit bosses multiple times. So a big part of strategy is keeping that skull, especially in those boss battles. However, if you do get hit just once, you do lose the skull, but you're able to find quite a few of them throughout. I think at least 2 per level, if not more, throughout the game. Decap Attack was actually one of the earliest Sega Genesis games I ended up playing, and I instantly ended up falling in love with the game. I remember dying a lot during the auto-scrolling levels that we're going to be seeing later on, and it took me a long time before I was finally able to beat the game. As soon as 1-3 begins, drop down and go to the right, attack the statue, and collect the first of the important items. Like I said, you have to get these items in the third part of each world in order to get to the end and beat the boss and all. One thing you've been noticing me collect throughout is the potions as well as coins. The coins are for the bonus game that we'll see after we beat the first world here. But the potions can do a variety of different things, helping you with things like invulnerability and other skills, so using them at certain points can be very useful for your gameplay. As we make our way over here, it's time for the first boss of the game. This witch doctor-like guy will come out, he'll charge across the screen, as well as he'll stop and throw off his headdress thing and start having it fly around like a boomerang. What I like to do though is if you have the skull, you can throw it at him and have it just hit him a lot of times as he's standing still before he goes into his next set of attacks. After just a few attacks like this though, he ends up being defeated and we're moving on to the second world. In between each world is the bonus game. If you've collected any coins, you can then spend them by putting one of these chucks on one of these islands. It'll then travel all the way across the map to the end spot, which you then get a randomized set of paths and bonus items that you can potentially get. You can have up to as many coins as you've collected of chucks in the different areas, and your main goal is to try to either get some special potions or maybe the extra life machine, which is that thing in the upper left corner, which just so happens to be where I hit now. The number on it is the amount of bonus lives you get for every chuck that goes in. So you can end up getting a decent amount of bonus lives if you have some coins to spend. For completing each world, you'll then have that part of the body that it was on move back to the center of the screen and properly get to its spot. We're now moving on to Elbow Island, the second world of the game. Controlling Chuck can be a bit difficult, and it's probably one of the things people don't end up liking that much about the game. he has very slippery controls. It's the same in all the Vic Tokai games that are like this, but it takes a while to get used to. However, I love the fact you're able to kick in the air while jumping, and that way you're able to kind of float over areas. It's just a weird oddity that's included here. I also think a lot of the creature designs overall were either creative or at least cool looking. Near the end of the stage, you want to drop on down here. There's some steam that's pushing you up, but it does stop for a few moments, in which case you can kind of get through, and this will lead you to the end of 2-1. As 2-2 begins, drop down into the water, watching out for the jellyfish. Break open the blocks here before heading back to the surface. We can use the steam to kind of get up a little bit, and for most of the stage we're going to be taking the upper path through it. It's just a lot easier to get through. The only thing you really got to be careful for is at the end of the level there's a series of conveyor belt things going up and down, and you have to kind of jump your way between them. If you fall too far down though, there is lava located down below, which will be an instant death if you end up landing in it. As we begin 2-3, this is a level that we're going to be working our way down. I like the fact that the game does mix up some of the horizontal and vertical scrolling style of levels, as well as you have the auto-scrolling ones we got to deal with. As we drop down this part, you can break open a couple of these objects and get some coins, but in the upper left corner of this segment, you have to kind of get up here. You can use the steam or do a jump. This is where the object that you need to find in order to complete the level is located for 2-3. Then work your way back down through the rest of the level. It's pretty straightforward, not really a lot of paths, and when you make it to the end, here we have our next boss, this giant frog, or toad. He hops over across to the middle of the screen and then has all these little tiny frogs pop out of the holes in its back. It's kind of a creepy boss for sure. After he ends up doing that, he'll then continue to jump around, or she'll continue to jump around, I'm not quite sure. Either way, once you end up defeating it, we're going to be moving on to the next world. "3-1 is an auto-scrolling level. You have this giant totem pole of death that's coming your way, and if it makes contact with you, it's an instant death, so you always have to make sure that you're staying near the front of the screen. It starts off pretty simple, just some basic enemies and platforms. You gotta be careful not to be too close to the far right, because the enemies will of course end up appearing and could end up hitting you. This is where things start to get a little bit more difficult. The springs are introduced, and you'll have a couple of tight corridors you have to quickly get through before the giant totem pole ends up running into you. This is the first level of this game that really ended up kicking my butt a lot. For whatever reason, I had trouble getting through the tight areas near the end of the level. I just ended up always just being a little bit short and barely getting touched. One of the more satisfying things for me always was to just step on the enemies in the game just once, so that they're stuck in the ground and they can't move, but then the totem pole ends up running into them to finish them off. I don't know, it just seems it's really cruel, but for whatever reason it was pretty satisfying. This is where the trouble spot is. You have to bounce up these walls and get through this very small little opening. It kinda is difficult. You basically have to bounce off the top and then do a couple of kicks just to float enough to get on the very top and then drop straight down. You have a very small window to do it, and for whatever reason as a kid, I always ended up dying there. As we begin 3-2, this is another level where you have to scroll upwards. Start off by heading up these platforms, and we're going to hit a spring on the left side, and then bounce up a couple of times before getting to this platform where we'll have to break open a couple of blocks. Watch out for the turtle spike weird looking enemy monster guy, and then continue up the area. Over here you'll have to bounce between these two sets of bouncy walls to head up. This is a little tricky as you have to hit these steams, and since the platforms are right under one another, it can be difficult to kind of get around. You'll have to use these to keep boosting yourself up. When we make it to the very top though, just have one last little enemy waiting for you, and you'll hit the goal. "3-3 is another level where we're going to have to keep an eye out for an item. This one's a little bit better hidden than the other ones that we've had to deal with thus far. Head over here to the right side. There's a lot of enemies along this path, and eventually the little area here will open up so you can drop down into the water. Once you're down below the water, head all the way over to the far left side until eventually you make it here. Break open all these blocks and head to the left, breaking open each of these statues. The one at the very, very far end, past another set of breakable blocks, is the item that you need to grab in order to beat the level. Once you have the item, you just have to work your way back the same exact path we just took. Any enemy that you end up passing over, of course, is still going to end up being there, so be careful of that. Once you do make it over to this spot, kind of lure this really crazy fish out a little bit so that you can get past him and back out of the water. Once you're out, head to the right. Don't float too high above the ground so that you end up accidentally falling into the lava. You're then going to use these steam things in order to kind of get up. Be careful of the lava and do a running jump if possible all the way over here and drop down. It's now time for the next boss encounter. This boss is a gigantic guy who's standing in the center. We're going to use one of the potions here in order to help us out. This gives us a special charge shot that does a pretty good amount of damage to whatever it ends up hitting. This guy is a bit more difficult as far as hitting him is concerned with the skull. You'll have to do quite a bit of your normal attacks by jumping up and attacking him in the head, but make sure that he doesn't accidentally run into you when he's trying to come back towards you. During the fight, he'll come to a stop and then have his head rotate around, firing out fireballs every time that the head stops. But not after too long, he ends up being defeated, and we're moving on to the fourth world of the game. The fourth world starts us underneath the water. There's a bunch of jellyfish right at the beginning, and then an otter waiting for you before we end up popping out back to the surface. A few moments later, though, you'll be dropping back down into the water. Watch out for another one of those otters, as well as some of the skeleton fish that are going to be swimming to the left side. Another thing that I always found odd in the Vic Tokai platform games is that weird thing. There's a one in every one of the games where you basically just bounce back and forth before eventually being flinged off of it. It works well for getting across certain areas a lot quicker, but still ends up just being a bit weird. A large portion of the stage we can do the float over and get across pretty fast. Just be careful near the end. There's a decent amount of enemies as well as some platforms that fall apart up above a big pit of lava. For 4-2, we're going to wait a couple of seconds for these fish to come up. As soon as they get to the surface, one will probably jump towards you. If you do it right, you can end up hitting him with the skull or your normal attack, but a lot of times I just do it to lure him out enough so that I can get down into the water. There's some of the more annoying enemies because of how big they are, as well as the small areas they usually are. It can be difficult to get around them. Most of this area is pretty straightforward. You'll have a couple of jellyfish enemies and a few others that you'll have to deal with, but pretty much just wait for your opportunities or take out a couple of enemies to make the path a bit easier. When you make it down here, you have a little bit of an opening. You can kind of continue along your path. It'll feel like forever, but eventually you can make it back up to the surface area. Use the steam to kind of boost your way up, and you can do a couple of these bouncy wall jumps that are always fun, and then continue up. After making the turn, you'll drop down pretty much identical to the area we just did. There is one of those crazy fish in the water right below the exit, so be careful not to get hit by him as he jumps up, and move on to 4-3. As we start off in 4-3, head upwards, we can get through that weird springy tower thing, and then make our way to the right side. Drop down into the water below and go through the little opening. You'll then come to an area where you can go left or right. We're going to start off by heading to the left side. Break open the blocks and watching out for the enemies, and then you're going to have to do a couple of leaps over some lava. And in the far left bottom corner is the key item, which is the one we need in order to beat the level. Be careful going back through though in case you use the bridges to get there so you don't end up hitting that lava there. Now we can head to the right side, breaking open all these blocks along the way. A few moments after that though, you'll have another big giant series of blocks. You can get some extra items if you want to, but our main goal is to get through the level, so we're going to take the bottom path so you don't have to worry about all those other blocks right there. Now right after that though is the opposite, where we're going to be breaking open these blocks and slowly working our way upwards to the next platform. Take out the otter enemies, or at least one of them, so that you're making up to the surface safely. Head to the left and you can use this spring to bounce up to the top platform and then run over to the far right side. Right after that giant red tower springy thing, we're going to drop down into the water once again to continue on in the level. Over here to the right, bounce up this wall to the next area. There's a few jellyfish here. Take those guys out and then continue. This is definitely one of the slower levels in the game because of all the water that we have to deal with. Watch out for another one of those crazy looking fish before we get out on the surface area, where we're finally able to get to the end and finish up the level where we have the boss. The boss is a giant floating weird alien brain type thing. It moves back and forth just so you can jump on top of it for a bit, and eventually will open up. When it opens up, make sure that you're not standing on top of it. You'll then be able to attack the weird creature that's sitting inside of this ship. He'll also end up throwing out little versions of himself, or little puddles of orange goo onto the ground that will start hopping around. Make sure you either let them go off screen or take them out. Here we're going to use another one of the special potions, similar to the one that we used before, because it does a pretty powerful attack to the boss. As you can see, it did a pretty decent amount of damage as we've now changed his color, which anytime one of the bosses ends up changing their color, they do get a bit faster and more difficult to deal with. Once he is finally taken down though, we're moving on to the fifth world of the game. The fifth world of the game has a nice little color scheme to it, as well as the volcano that's kind of looming in the background. Thankfully, we don't have to worry about going inside that or anything. But the level is filled with lots of lava that we're going to have to dodge. Over here, you can make a big leap, and you can actually get over the breakable blocks. If you can't make that jump, you can break them, of course, to go through. Watch out for some crazy fish popping out of that big set of water before jumping up this spring to another top ledge with a bunch of breakable blocks. If you're getting a little bit low on health, you can climb up here in order to grab a piece of heart. And then we're going to continue over to the right side, jumping over a flock of the duck enemies coming our way before we finish up the level. "5-2 is another one of those auto-scrolling style of levels. Here we have a weird gorilla tank-like thing that's slowly rolling through the stage. He has a weird mouth that he ends up sending out, similar to like the little mini mouth inside of the xenomorphs from Aliens. But for the most part, we're just going to try to keep up with everything going on. Lots of enemies, breakable blocks, things you'll have to climb. It's a bit more difficult than the last auto-scroller we had back in 3.1. The level has a decent amount of upper platforms that you're going to be able to take that will help you get through a large portion of the level. Anytime I end up having to land back down on the ground area, I usually try to do my best to get back up to the top section as fast as possible. It can be a bit difficult at times to jump over some of these barricades, especially jumping on the heads of enemies, but I usually end up finding it a bit easier to go that way. Thankfully, after that big long segment there, we're almost to the end. There's a couple of more breakable walls that we have to destroy in order to get Chuck through. As 5-3 begins, start heading over to the right side. There's a few of those jumping piranha plant-like enemies that you can only end up hitting once their face is shown, so always keep that in mind with them. After a bit of lava, you'll have a couple of series of water pools that you'll be able to easily get over, then followed up with plenty of more lava. Stop here though in order to break open the statue to find the item that you need to grab in order to beat this one. Pretty out in the open, considering some of the other ones have been a little bit better hidden. That one at least ends up standing out. The level isn't particularly long though before we make it to the end to face a pretty challenging boss in the Giant Gopher. He's also a pretty cool boss. You can use the skull to really end up helping you with this fight. He moves back and forth, stopping every so often to pop up, and when he does pop up, it's not only your opportunity to hit him, he'll also end up throwing a bunch of rocks your way. Now, after dealing enough damage to him, he'll change color and, of course, get a lot faster. When he does this, not only, of course, is it tougher to dodge him when he does pop out, he throws 3 rocks at one time, which can, of course, be a lot more challenging to get around. If you don't end up having the skull, you'll have to kind of get in close quickly, usually kind of doing a slide underneath the rocks you can do sometimes, in order to get right up next to him and you can deliver a couple of hits to him before he ends up going back down. Once he is defeated though, we're moving on to the 6th world of the game. What would a platforming game be without some sort of ice-themed level? And we have that here. We have a weird clown penguin-looking guy on skis. You also have little green things using the giant hammers. Over a series of water, we're going to take the upper path on all of these platforms here. We can get up to the very top and do a big floating running jump so we can get a pretty good distance through the level. Once we do that, drop on down, watch out for the spiky turtle guys before continuing over to the right side. The little penguin guys work very similarly to the flurry enemies from Super Mario Bros. 2 as far as the way they move and slide back and forth down a series of platforms. Once you're up here, do a running leap to the right. You can actually jump over this series of ice blocks to skip a little bit of area right there. Continuing over to the right, drop down. Now you have to be very careful as there's a bunch of lava set up here with a few of these breakable bridges. When you drop down the next segment, there's even more lava below, and there's only a few platforms that you're able to kind of bounce off of and be safe. Then, spring your way up a whole bunch of walls to the very top and just kind of work your way back and forth through a series of ledges while dealing with the penguin guys. When you do make it to the bottom, a couple more enemies before we make it to the end and complete 6-1. As we begin 5-2, this is another level that's going to be a scrolling upwards style of stage. We're going to start climbing up a series of platforms. It'll be a bit difficult to keep your balance on these platforms because of the ice being so slippery. bounce up, be careful, you have just the little individual ice squares that you'll have to jump on in order to kind of get through. After that, though, is where the real fun begins, as you have lots of large lava pools and very small platforms for you to jump on. Take your time as much as needed before eventually we make it to the end of that segment and start heading up. Over here to the right, you have one of those crazy fish. You can kind of just stand on the very edge here and he'll jump towards you. That little bit of a jump will allow you to kind of get past. Head up, you'll break open a few blocks and you have a lot of these swimming underwater enemies that are going to try to run into you during this segment. Break open another wall before making it back out of the water. Here it's filled with all the little green guys with their giant hammers trying to squash you, as well as shaking the whole screen a little bit. Here we have a couple of small little corridors we have to run through and a bunch of the penguin enemies that are scattered about. Head up, you can bounce on a series of these upward bouncy blocks, and then we're into another segment where we have some more of the penguins, but much easier than the one we just dealt with a few moments ago. This is a pretty lengthy stage overall with a lot of segments that if you end up falling, make sure that you are careful of any lava that is located below you. Eventually though, we do make it to the top. After a few more hammer guys, we finish up 6-2. As we begin 6-3, start over to the right, there's a few of those weird green hammer guys. Bounce up this wall and get to the top portion here. Once you're here, run all the way over to the right side and continue along the broken bridge parts all the way to the right. Once you make it to a wall, drop down and head all the way to the left across all of these bridges. They'll of course fall, so you need to move fast so you don't hit the lava. In this segment though is the location of the item that we need to grab. Once you have that, you can jump up safely to the next platform and then head back the way we came. Once you get back here though, drop on down. You'll have a bunch of the bouncing springs and a few penguin guys to deal with. Once you're on the very bottom segment, you have a couple of those turtle guys moving back and forth. Pretty easy to deal with, just wait for them to either attack or jump over them as you make your way over to the far right. It'll then open up. Here you have another one of the segment with all these platforms moving up and down, and you have to quickly kind of get through without accidentally falling into the lava. Right after the first segment of them, there's another segment of them with a bunch of icy platforms. This time though, I usually like to just jump and hover over against the wall, and usually can land safely. After that is a whole series of more of those hammer guys before we make it to the boss, which is this giant Yeti guy. He stands in the middle and you have to wait for him to lift up his arms into the air. When he does that, you'll then be able to attack his stomach in order to do damage. It can be difficult to kind of get the rhythm of it, so he'll open up so you'll be able to just mash the attack button in order to deliver a lot of hits fast. Eventually he'll cover back up and the process continues over again. The skull really isn't effective in any way during this fight unless you just do your normal hit when he does lift his arms, so you can at least get one hit out of it. After a while, he'll jump up into the air and start spewing little tiny ice balls towards you. The first one ends up hitting me, but if you stand kind of right here on the one side of him, if you time it right, you can jump, so every time he spits, it'll just go right under you, and you'll be able to land an attack. Once he's defeated though, we're moving on to the 7th and final world of the game. "7-1 starts off as a pretty easy stage, just kind of heading to the right, few enemies in our way. As we float on down to the bottom section here, we're going to then bounce off of this wall and head up. You'll then come to a big area of water. There's one of those crazy fish. It can be a little bit difficult as far as dodging is concerned, as we're going to head across that water to the right side. Jump along these broken bridge parts. You may be able to jump up to the top, but unfortunately if you're unable to, you'll have to drop down into the water, breaking open a series of blocks and try to get underneath these fish. After dealing with a bunch of them, we'll head out back onto land and continue to the left. Thankfully, just a series of very easy enemies to deal with. Up here, though, is the location of a heart piece, which is where we were trying to jump to earlier so we didn't have to go through that water segment, but wasn't able to get enough momentum. At the end, though, drop all the way down to the bottom and head to the right to finish up the stage. For 7-2, run to the right. You'll have a piece of bridge that will start to break apart. You'll quickly notice, though, that this level is another one of the ones where we have to work our way down. Thankfully, we're able to get one of the skull helpers in order to kind of help us out through this part. Be careful while dropping down all the broken pieces of bridge, because there is plenty of lava. And of course, that's going to be an instant death if you fall into it. Not long of a level, though, before we end up making it to the bottom, and we're moving on to 7-3, the final stage of the game. 7-2 wasn't long of a level, but 7-3 makes up for it. As we begin the level, watch out for this lava pit. Head down, you're going to break open this wall. Wait for the turtle guy to kind of get away. You also have that angry, crazy fish trying to get to you. Then go through the opening. This will allow you to kind of get to this segment where we're going to jump over to the right, bounce up this wall, and then continue over to the next segment. Once you're here, drop on down, breaking open this wall and avoiding all of the different kinds of fish, in order to find this chalice located right here, which is the final one of the items that we need to collect, and now we just have to worry about making it through the rest of the area and completing the game. Take out the crazy fish if you can before jumping back onto the surface, and then springing our way all the way over a large amount of space. In the next segment, you'll have a bunch of springs and some of the werewolf guys trying to run into you. After climbing up here, breaking open this wall, start to drop on down. A bunch of those hammer guys are waiting for us, but they're pretty easy to deal with. Work your way down once again, just a bunch of spiky turtle guys, no lava for us to deal with, and a pretty easy final little area before we now make it to the boss battle. As you can see, the boss is quite a large guy, and we're going to have to jump up in order to attack his head. We can stand right next to him about where his shoulder spikes are, and this will allow you to jump up in order to hit him a bunch while also being a decent distance away, so you can back up while he's moving towards you, so you can get away from his attacks. Every so often he'll split into two and then fire a fireball that will then home on you and start following you around. It can be difficult to keep dodging this while also delivering attacks. He'll then summon a bunch of rocks at times that will fall down. Thankfully, there are not that many of them, and there's a decent gap usually between a few of them, so that you're able to avoid getting hit too much. He'll then summon another fireball that you'll have to deal with. You now have two fireballs chasing you. Hopefully, you're able to kind of get them to kind of go into one another, so that way it really is kind of like just one you're trying to deal with. However, if you're able to deliver enough attacks, though, we get to sit back and enjoy the ending, the Decap Attack, on the Sega Genesis. So there you have it, Decap Attack for the Sega Genesis. Like I mentioned earlier, one of my absolute favorite games on the Genesis. A lot of nostalgia for this one, so I'm glad I was finally able to get to do it for play it through. Unfortunately, there's never been an actual sequel to Decap Attack. I've always wanted one and was hoping Sega would kind of resurrect it at some point. The game at least does always get kind of included with the Sega Genesis collections that end up getting released and re-released over the years, so it's not completely forgotten about, but I doubt we'll ever probably end up seeing anything more from it. As the credits finish up, we then get one last the end screen, and then you can reset the game and start it all over again. But with that, guys, going to wrap up this episode of Play It Through. I'd like to thank you for watching, and of course, I hope you enjoyed.